Thank you again for joining me here at Bert's Books, where today we're going to be looking at David Wiltshire's 1978 Cold War period thriller The Nightmare Man, originally published as Child of Vodyanoi. Wiltshire's novel was famously serialised by the BBC in 1981, being adapted into a four-part series by Robert Holmes and directed by Douglas Camfield, both of whom had their respective groundings in TV science fiction. David Wiltshire had established himself as a writer in parallel to his career as a dentist, and themes from his day job would be incorporated into his fiction. This was his second novel after 1978's The Homicide, and represents an arguable entree into the admittedly niche genre of dental horror, of which another contender might be considered William Goldman's Marathon Man. Wiltshire would also submit a storyline for intended use in Tales of the Unexpected, also on the dentistry theme, so clearly he was on a bit of a mission with this. Child of Vodyanoi was reputedly inspired by the 1950s Howard Hawks science fiction flick The Thing from Another World, this particular edition being the 1981 reprint, which was rejacketed with its new title to lock it in with the TV series. We open to a bleak wintry beach scene on the island of Inverness, which is situated in the Outer Hebrides, where TV writer Sheila Anderson, who has exiled herself to this location in order to work for a script for a historical drama, is walking her collie dog Whiskey. Now at this point, anyone with a passing interest in horror might already be hearing alarm bells. A remote Scottish island, now that's got to be trouble, hasn't it? Well, yes, but not in the way you might think. Certainly Whiskey the collie has sensed trouble and is showing signs of doggy nervousness at having sniffed out an object on the dunes, namely a mysterious craft which seems to have been abandoned there. She could only gape at what she took to be a small, near-wingless aircraft. There's no sign of a pilot, but peeping through the hatch, Sheila can perceive a dull, diffused red light. Instinctively at this point, she bolts, heading nervously towards her house, which has no phone nor electric lighting and is showing signs now of having been broken into. But she's going to have to enter the gloomy depths in order to retrieve her car keys. Just as she thinks she's home dry, a shape fills the doorway. She cannot scream immediately as her heart has stalled. Fainting, she fell back, urine streaming down her legs, her disintegrating mind full of revulsion and fear. We cut from here to the island's golf course where Ian Dunlop, a stocky 37-year-old ex-paratrooper and also, yes, the novel's resident dentist, he's taking advantage of the lack of winter custom to get in a bit of practice. He loses a ball, and as it's getting towards nightfall, he resolves to restrict his search to only a few minutes. Something in the undergrowth attracts his attention, and to his horror he realises it's a human body. Hardened ex-para though he is, what he discovers there causes him to retch, and deeply shaken he hurries back to the clubhouse to call the authorities. Inspector Duncan Inskip takes the call. Dunlop informs him that it's not a pretty sight. The corpse is missing its head. The next chapter sees Inskip along with Sergeant Robinson meeting with Dunlop at the clubhouse, and after a fortifying nip of scotch, the police are led to the site of the killing. They agree to section off the area for the night, but then there's a shout from a white-faced Sergeant Robertson, who appears to be holding a rope that is hanging from a tree. At first they cannot understand why the sergeant is looking so distressed. As they get nearer they realise the implication of the rope and a second one which has brushed the sergeant's face. The branches were festooned with shiny green ribbons. It was human viscera. The inevitable conclusion from this is that their little community must be harbouring a maniac. That man, it says, is not even a normal psychopath. Thoroughly disturbed by what he's witnessed, Ian Dunlop now heads off to meet his current romantic involvement, who is the little town's chemist, Fiona Patterson. At dinner at the local hotel, he confides in her what has happened on the golf course, which rather ruins the atmosphere of the meal. Anyhow, they head back to Fiona's and the narrative moves back to the site of the golf course, in which we get the viewpoint of something nameless which has been italicised. It watched the two men as a match flared and lit their faces, casting their images momentarily in its glass eyepieces. The breathing was heavy, laboured, causing an intermittent vacuum in the tube that sucked and pulled at the mask. The two bobbies see the reflection of whatever is watching them, but opt not to investigate at this point in the wet and the dark, and they never quite realise how close they've come. We cut to the following morning, and the unpleasant business of a post-mortem is being undertaken by a Dr. Mackay, and the inevitable speculation comes as to who or what would have done this. A specialised murder squad is now called in from Glasgow. Inspector Inskip, meanwhile, is being shown to the spot where last night's observer must have been hiding, where curious footprints, presumably human, reveal themselves. In the meantime, Ian has been approached by Dr. Mackay, who wants to call in his dental expertise in identifying who or what the killer might have been. In the laboratory, Ian identifies bite marks of a kind and takes casts of them, just as Mackay reveals, shockingly, that the victim had also been sexually assaulted. As the day progresses, police teams comb the island, while out to sea, far to the north, a Force 11 gale begins to gather, which moves in at speed, and the storm interrupts the ferry passage of the Glaswegian police team. The rolling and pitching vessel, on descending the depths of an enormous trough, makes contact with some metallic object, fragments of which become entangled with the boat, and they appear to be part of either an aircraft or some type of missile. Oblivious to all this on the island, police and forensic work continues, and in Dunlop's laboratory his assistant begins work on the dental casts that have been taken. While the impressions appear to be of human teeth, there's something very weird about the upper jaw, which appears more like an artificial ridge. Elsewhere, Dr. Mackay has detected anomalies in the sperm cell samples, which would seem to indicate radioactive mutation. Inskip and Robertson, meanwhile, are checking on the more isolated homesteads on the island, and on arriving at Sheila Anderson's, as the wind ominously rises, they discover what has taken place there. In the dark of her cottage interior, the pair of them are becoming increasingly creeped out. Something in the next room falls over, and nervously they push a door open and are greeted with a blood-curdling snarl. Ah no, it's only Whiskey the dog, who's been guarding Sheila Anderson's separated head, and the dog is now out of his mind, to the extent that Robertson has to brain it with a chair leg. The head they now have to pick up by the hair and take back for examination, where on seeking out Dr. Mackay, it transpires that the storm has blown all the island's telephones out. They find the doctor in the company of Dunlop, where they're informed that from the dental impressions it transpires that the attacker must have been wearing a mask of some sort, that he also must have been exposed to a large dose of atomic radiation. From this they nervously speculate that the attacker must literally be a freak, abnormal, a monster. On returning back to his room that evening, Ian is then summoned by Fiona, who informs him that in spite of their obvious feelings for each other, she feels obliged to return to her estranged husband who lives on the mainland, which is something of a bitter pill for Dunlop to swallow, particularly after the 24 hours he's just had. We cut from here to the ornithologist, Dr. Simmons, who is camped out on an isolated part of the island, observing the movements of barnacle geese. He's in the process of recording his findings onto a portable tape deck, which is synced up to his camera and flash pack, which happens to have a faulty mechanism. It fires off unprompted, a fault which is giving the doctor some trouble. However, the flash has been observed by the mysterious party whose reactions are being described in italic text. From this viewpoint, we see the outline of the man within the tent's fabric. We cut back to Simmons, who has been startled by noise outside, which he at first attributes to sheep. But when the fabric of his tent is ripped asunder, he realises to his horror that it's something very, very different. As his flash mechanism illuminates the frames of unfolding horror, a hot red liquid pumps out over the remnants of the tent and slowly coagulates in the cold. Dunlop awakes the next morning somewhat bummed out over Fiona's bombshell to find there's been a power outage and the landscape outside is of an Arctic nature. Inskip appears and they liven up their morning with another nip of the Glenmorangie. Inskip then invites Ian to join him on a visit to the Coast Guard station, who are apparently furnished with a Geiger counter. It's a difficult drive in the snowy conditions, but they make it over and they're greeted by three stout nautical types, one of whom mentions that by coincidence when they were checking the Geiger counter a short while ago it suddenly started to register a reading, if only for half an hour, which seemed to indicate a travelling source of radiation. One of the Coast Guards, McGrath, mentions Dr. Simmons and his camp, so they trek out there through the snow to find the camp wrecked and Simmons' mutilated remains, and they realise that he's had his eyes put out. Having brought Simmons' remains back to the Coast Guard station, speculation then begins how the killer could be surviving the outside conditions. You mean he's glowing like the boy in the TV advert who's had his porridge oats? That'll be ready, Breck. Joking apart, what the hell is out there? On this thought, they all bunk down for the night. Around 2:30, Dunlop awakes, feeling a bit rough from all the whiskey that they'd rounded off the previous evening with. But he's disturbed by a noise from the room in which Simmons' body is lying. Nervously entering to try to identify the cause of the buzzing sound, Dunlop bends over the canvas bag which contains the body. The eye sockets begin to pool with blood, and then the corpse's head rises and its arms encircle him. And the lights come on, and the Coast Guard boys are shaking Dunlop out of his bad dream. A real nightmare, sympathises Inskip. My nightmare man, you mean. Really having to pee this time, Dunlop's curiosity draws him into the room where the body lies, for real this time. However, this time he's startled by a strange, pointed silhouette that's framed in the window, and when he moves forward to investigate, he's horrified to see a grotesque figure observing him through strange goggles on the other side of the glass, as if wearing a gas mask. Frantically alerting the others, everybody then piles outside with iron bars in their hands for protection, but the only trace they now have is the buzzing signal from the Geiger counter, which Dunlop recognises as the strange noise from his dream, which indicates the mysterious source of radiation which is receding beyond the hill. They seem to be safe, at least for now. There's no sleep for anybody the rest of that night. More whiskey does the rounds in the morning, and McGrath informs everybody that the ferry which had been carrying the Glasgow police team over had to be put back. Now, having learned the nature of the wreckage with which the ferry had collided, they're now speculating as to whether the mysterious killer is even of a terrestrial origin. Dunlop and Inskip now have to return to the town with the body, so they borrow a small boat from the Coast Guard, leaving them with strict instructions that they have to take care of themselves and no false heroics. Safely back, Inskip begins to plan the evacuation of anybody living in the outlying areas and agrees to rendezvous later with Dunlop at the pathology lab in the evening. Dropping in on Fiona on his way home, Dunlop is then informed about the ornithologist's camera equipment, and on the off chance that Simmons' shots might have caught something relevant prior to his death, Ian heads back to the police station to retrieve the films. It's then that they realise that there's been this fault with Simmons' equipment, and the possibility suggests itself that the footage of the ornithologist's last moments might actually have been caught on camera. Dunlop carries the equipment back over to Fiona's, which she agrees to develop. The initial results do seem inconclusive until Ian suggests that she might try running them into a sequence as with a cine film. Leaving her to it, Dunlop then returns to the path lab, where the police doctor reveals that not only was Simmons' body mutilated, it appears he was also cannibalised. Attempting to piece the available evidence together, the extraterrestrial explanation is beginning to look more plausible. Fiona meanwhile is working on her cine film, and after the first test run of it she is absolutely horrified at what it seems to reveal. Thoroughly spooked, she then glimpses in the dim light of her shop a menacing silhouette, and she shrinks fearfully into the rear of the shop with her heart pounding. As she's about to scream, she then realises that it's a promotional cutout that's been standing in the shop. Still trembling, she edges out to head towards the Path Lab, where her sequence is to receive its first public screening. At first the details are indistinct, but then the unmistakable form becomes discernible. A tall pointed outline, inset with round eyes, that were the burnt blazing holes of spoiled yellow film, lunged down after the hapless victim, before jets of fluid shot up intermittently like a faulty fountain, at which point Fiona can hold down her stomach contents no longer and flees for the lavvy. As the various parties present attempt to reassure her, she explains how much harder it is for her to accept what she's just witnessed than with any more ordinary tragedy. It's like my childhood idea of what a bogeyman looked like. They suddenly realise that they've yet to examine the contents of the tape recorder, but Fiona doesn't want to stick around for that, so Ian sees her home. Meanwhile, over at the Coast Guard station, the boys' card game comes to a pause when they detect a faint noise. They then realise that their heating has failed. Campbell volunteers to go and investigate. This involves heading outside to check on the tanks, where he realises one of them has been deliberately turned off. Turning the valve back, he then sees the outline of a pointed shadow from the door. The reflected light from a pair of goggles flashes over him, and then the blackness descends. Inside, McGrath and Fraser are beginning to wonder what's happened to him and venture outside to investigate, where they find Campbell suspended by a chain. He stared fixedly down at them with eyes bulging out of their sockets. Where his throat had been was just a red gash with bits of pipe sticking out. The pair flee back inside, where McGrath volunteers to head down to the armoury to procure their shotgun. Fraser doesn't like to be left alone though, and starts to head after him, but he then hears McGrath scream, and shortly after that hears him almost calmly asking for his mother. At which Fraser breaks and runs, barricading himself into the bunk room. Detecting what sound like human footprints outside, Fraser assumes that McGrath must somehow have come out on top from this encounter, and edges his door as far open as the barricading wardrobe allows him to, only to glimpse the monstrous shadow. Meanwhile, while this is going on, back in town, Fiona wakes up screaming, and Dunlop tries to reassure her that she's just had a nightmare, but she tells him that the horrible images from the film have almost instantaneously got right into her soul. It's representative of the deep instinctive fears that 20th century accoutrements have held at bay. Anyhow, it's the cue for her and Dunlop to resolve their on-hold relationship status. But just before sleep takes him, Ian perceives a soft pink glow reflected onto the ceiling, which actually emanates from the flames reflected in the low clouds to the northwest. The lighthouse station is on fire. Our thing, whatever it is, has set fire to the spilled oil, and Fraser is trapped in the bunk room. Attempting to escape through the window, a beam collapses onto his back, mercifully killing all feeling in his lower body as the flames begin to subsume him. He passes away within a confused hallucination of a childhood scene in which the menacing outline of this thing seems to intrude. Back in the town, everyone's been alerted to the fire now and form up an armed party to investigate. On their way out there, he inquires the police as to whether anything discernible was found on the tape recording. Dr. Mackay maintains that he could discern laughter, bursts of ape-like screeching. Human, I couldn't swear to it. They arrive to a scene of complete devastation, but are immediately distracted by the report that something has been spotted on the beach. It's that same bizarre craft that Sheila Anderson first spotted at the beginning of our story. The thing reminded Dunlop of a bat or a bomb. He couldn't decide which. On closer examination, the object is even more puzzling. On touching it, Dunlop quickly pulls his hand back. That's strange. It's not metal at all. It feels more like skin, warm skin. It's further described as a cross between a machine and an animal. They somehow shift the strangely lightweight machine onto the top of the police cruiser and then return to the Coast Guard station, where it turns out that the radio room has partially survived the fire. On the still functioning equipment, they put out a call describing the situation, which is intercepted by Coast Guard control inland.